Hello everybody, this is David Farrell with another music theory video. Today, the topic of the video is secondary dominant chords. In this video, we're going to talk about what secondary dominant chords are, how to identify them, and how to use them in our compositions. Looking forward to this one, let's jump right in. I'd like to start this discussion by a quick review of the difference between diatonic and chromatic chords. Diatonic chords only use notes from the key that the music is in. Okay, most of the chords that we've looked at so far have been diatonic chords. When we're talking about a minor key, this does include the notes from the melodic and the harmonic minor scale, and so we've got a couple extra chords in the minor scales and minor keys, more chords there than we do have in the major keys. When we're talking about these chords, we label them with Roman numerals based on the scale degree of the root, right? So if we see a triad built on the third note of the scale, we give a Roman numeral 3. If we see a seventh chord based on the sixth note of the scale, we would label it with a 6, 7. This is all old stuff. Chromatic chords use notes that are not in the key. Chromatic notes are pitches that are not from our major or minor key signature, nor are they from our melodic or harmonic minor scale. Okay? There are a lot of different types of chromatic chords, and we'll be going through a lot of them. All these chromatic chords have different functions, different jobs for them to do in the music. We're going to be labeling them in different ways as well. We don't really label them the same way we label diatonic chords, depending on what type of chromatic chord. So just a quick review, diatonic means we're from the key, from the major or minor key. Chromatic means we're borrowing from outside of the key. And what we're going to do with those chromatic chords depends on the type. Let's talk about our first type, the type that we're going to be looking at in this video. So in case you didn't know already, secondary dominants are a type of chromatic chord. They're one of these different chromatic chords that we can talk about. Secondary dominants are probably the most common group of chromatic chords. We see secondary dominants all over the place in music. In fact, when I'm trying to find things for you to analyze in your Theory 1 and Theory 2 classes, one of the challenges is to find music that doesn't use a secondary dominant. This is just how prevalent they are in music. Okay? Here's some important information about secondary dominants. First of all, secondary dominants are always major triads or major minor seventh chords. Okay? Whenever we see a secondary dominant, it's going to fit into one of these categories. The best way to think about secondary dominants is to think of them as borrowing. Okay? We are borrowing a dominant, a 5 chord, from another key. Okay, we're going to borrow a 5, but not the 5 that we typically see in our key. We're going to borrow a 5 from some other chord, and usually we're going to borrow from the key of a different diatonic triad. And so if we are in the key of C major, perhaps we would borrow a dominant from the key of 2, from the key of D minor. Or perhaps we would borrow a dominant from the key of G, from the key of our 5 chord. Okay? Important also, these chords do not present a change of key. We'll talk about that in the future, but what they present is a very brief, momentary tonicization of another chord. That's our technical term. Tonicization means we are pretending that a chord is the tonic for just a moment. We're pretending we're in a different key for just a moment, not a big, long change of key. Let's look at some music in action. Here we've got a short chord progression in the key of D major, 2 sharps, D major, and I've started my Roman numeral analysis. I found my tonic triad at the beginning and the end of my phrase, and I also found my dominant right before 1, a 1 and a 5 and a 1. But in the middle of there, I've got a chromatic chord, okay? I know it's a chromatic chord because it's got an accidental in it from outside the key. It's got a G sharp, and I know that there is no G sharp in my key of D major. So I have to figure out what kind of chromatic chord this is. We'll have more questions to help guide us towards different chromatic chords, but right now, since we're looking only at secondary dominants, here are some of the questions that are going to gear us towards finding out if our chromatic chord is a secondary dominant. First, we can ask, is the chord chromatic? Does it contain notes from outside the scale? In this case, the answer is yes. Almost all of our secondary dominant chords contain chromatic pitches, and so this is a really good first indicator. The second thing we have to ask is Is the chord a major triad or a major minor seventh? Remember, our secondary dominant chords are all either major triads or major minor seventh chords. And so I need to look at the pitches and decide whether or not this falls into that category. Here, my pitches are E, G sharp, and D natural with a doubled E. This is a pretty common way to spell a dominant seventh chord, a major minor seventh chord with the fifth omitted. E, G sharp, and that omitted B spell our major triad, and the D natural a minor seventh above the root. So yes, this is a major minor seventh chord. And finally, we want to ask ourselves what diatonic chord's root is a perfect fifth below the root of this chord? Or this chord is 5 of what? This is commonly how I abbreviate the question. So this chord is in E, major minor seventh chord. Well, E is 5 notes above what? E is 5 of what? We need to know this to label our secondary dominant chord. E is the dominant in the key of A. And so E7 is 5/7 of A. In the key of D major, A is 5, and that means that this E7 chord is borrowed from the key of A. This E7 chord is borrowed from the key of 5, and so we will call it 5/7 of 5. When I write the chord, I'll use a slash like I've done here, 5/7 /5, and we'll read that as 5/7 of 5. We've borrowed this 5/7 from another key. We borrowed it from the key of 5, and in the case of D major, the key of 5 is A. We've borrowed a dominant from the key of A. This is not the regular dominant of D major, this is a dominant from another key, and that's why this is a secondary dominant. We could say that we are tonicizing the dominant here. We are tonicizing 5, we are tonicizing A. We are pretending very briefly, for just one chord, that we are in the key of A, and we're going to use the dominant from that key, which is E7. Here it is, 5/7 of 5. These are the steps that we can go through when we're working with secondary dominants. If we see a chromatic chord, that's going to be clue number 1. We want to look at the pitches of that chord and see if they spell a major triad or a major minor seventh chord. If they don't, the chord is not a secondary dominant. And finally, to identify which secondary dominant the chord is, we need to look at what pitch is being tonicized. The secondary dominant is 5 of what? Is it borrowing from the key of 5? Is it borrowing from the key of 2 or 6 or somewhere else? These are the questions we'll be asking every time we see a secondary dominant. Not every chromatic chord will be a secondary dominant. Look at this similar chromatic chord. It's also chromatic. It's got a G sharp and an F natural, 2 pitches from outside our D major scale. And so when we look at the first question, is the chord chromatic? The answer is a clear yes. But is the chord a major triad or a major minor seventh? If we look at our pitches here, G sharp, B, D, and F natural, we spell a fully diminished seventh chord. This is not a major triad or a major minor seventh. And so our analysis for now will stop there, and we will simply be able to say this is not a secondary dominant. We'll have other chromatic chord categories, other categories of chromatic chords that we can talk about in the future, and this will help us identify some of our other chords. We just want to be careful at the beginning not to identify everything as a secondary dominant. I guess, or at the end, not to identify everything as a secondary dominant, because there are a lot of chromatic chords. Let's look quickly at the dominants, secondary and otherwise, for our key of D major. On the bottom staff here, you can see all your friendly diatonic triads, all the triads that are in the key of D major. And on the top staff, you can see the dominants that are a fifth above them. So we start on the 1 chord, D major on the bottom staff, and above it we can see the 5 chord, A major. These are our friendly diatonic 1 and 5 chords. Notice that I did not write 5 of 1. Please don't do that. They're all of 1, and so we don't need to specify that. Above our E minor 2 chord, we see the B major 5 of 2 chord, a common secondary dominant. and above our F sharp minor 3 chord, a C sharp major 5 of 3. The 4 chord is G major here, and up above it we see 5 7 of 4, a D7 chord. I made this a 7th chord because if we look at the D major triad below, we notice that it's not a chromatic chord. A D major triad would just be a 1 chord. Labeling it as a 5 of 4 would be a little bit weird when it's such a common triad. But when we add the 7th, we add the chromatic tone, in this case a C natural, that makes it 5 7 of 4, a relatively common secondary dominant as well. Above our diatonic 5, A major, we have 5 of 5, E major, and above the 6 chord, B minor, we have 5 of 6, F sharp major. Notice there is no secondary dominant above the 7 chord. We typically do not tonicize diminished triads, and that's because there isn't really a C sharp diminished key that has a dominant in it. And so these are some secondary dominants that we will not see, tonicizations of diminished triads. We can move to the parallel minor and look at the dominants in D minor as well, and they will look similar. Our 1 chord has its 5 above it. 2, E diminished here, we notice, does not have a secondary dominant. Again, we typically don't tonicize diminished triads. Our 3 chord, F major, has a C major triad above it. This is a diatonic chord, right? This is a C major chord. Sometimes you see it labeled as capital 7 or flat major 7. It goes by a number of names. This chord tends to resolve to 3 anyways. Our major 7 chord tends to move to a 3 chord. And so labeling it as 7 or as 5 of 3, both chords have the same function, and we'll see both of those numerals with some frequency. Moving on to our 4 chord, G minor, we see that it has 5 of 4 above it. We remember 5 of 4 was a weird chord in the major key, but here it changes our tonic minor triad, D minor, to a tonic major triad, and so it's a little bit more common to see 5 of 4 in minor. 5 of 5 is next, an E major triad above our A major 5 chord, and our 6 chord, B flat, has a 5 7 of 6 above it, an F major minor 7 chord. Similar to our 5 of 4 in major, this chord is diatonic when we see it as a triad, right? An F major triad in the key of D minor would just be a 3 chord, but when we add that chromatic E flat, we change the labeling from 3 to 5 7 of 6. And again, there is no tonicization of our 7 diminished chord. We don't tonicize diminished triads. So there are lots of secondary dominants that we can find in these keys. Remember, we're looking for major triads and major minor 7th chords that are not from our typical key signature. That's going to be the biggest indicator of what we're looking for. I'd like to finish our talk by talking about part writing with secondary dominants. And this shouldn't be too rough because we've already learned how to part write with 5 7 chords and 5 triads a while back. Generally, our secondary dominants should be treated like regular 5 7s or 5 chords. We want our leading tone to resolve up and our 7th to resolve down. Let's look at our first example in the key of D major with a 5 7 of 5 resolving to a 5. We're borrowing from the key of A here, as we have been through most of these examples. And in the key of A, G sharp is the leading tone, and so you can see I resolve that G sharp in the tenor up by step to the A, like I like to do. The 7th of my 5 7 of 5 is the D natural. E is the root and D is a 7th above, and I resolve it down by step to a C sharp. My 5 chord has a doubled root, 1/3, 1/5, which is pretty typical. Pretty friendly voice leading. One common alteration to this voice leading is in the second example here. If we resolve our secondary dominant to another 7th chord, in this case, a 5 7 rather than a 5 triad, our secondary leading tone may move down chromatically. This is a pretty common voice leading. Here you can see that all of my voices resolve the same way, but now instead of that G sharp resolving up to A, I want it to resolve to the 7th of my 5 7 chord. So it will change from a G sharp to a G natural. This is a very smooth stepwise voice leading, very friendly, and so this is one we'll use and see with a lot of commonality. Finally, in my last example, I use a cadential 6/4. Notice that this is resolving a 5 7 of 5 to a cadential 6/4 Cadential 6/4 functions as part of the dominant, and so this is not an unusual resolution to see. We'll find this from time to time, and the voice leading here is quite smooth and quite simple as well. To recap, when we're working with these secondary dominants, just remember everything you know about part rating with 5, and you should be in pretty good shape. That's the end of our video on secondary dominants. In this video, we introduced you to one of the building blocks of chromatic harmony, and really one of the building blocks of all tonal music. We will encounter secondary dominants all over the place, and we'll be looking at lots of them, and we'll be incorporating them into our own composition. Thank you for watching the video. If you have questions, please let me know. Otherwise, thanks for watching, have a great day, and I'll see you in class.